Hello, welcome to another episode of the Safe Kids, Sane Parents Family Safety Podcast. I'm Jason.
And I'm Richard.
And this is episode 3 of this fledgling podcast. I wanted to tell folks that as we go along, we're going to start bringing in some guests with expertise beyond our own. If you saw in the show notes, Richard is a longtime martial arts master and public safety teacher. I'm a guy with a lot of martial arts experience, and I work as a travel writer, and we're both dads. So we're bringing that experience to the table, but in coming weeks, we'll have an ER doctor, we'll have a fire safety specialist, and a number of other guests to come in to share what they know about keeping families safe so that we can all do our jobs, and Richard and I can learn a thing or two as well. Now for today, this is going to be a war stories episode. It probably won't be the last, even though it's the first, where we're going to bring some stories and anecdotes from our own experience and other experiences and talk about what we did wrong, what we did right, and some resources where folks can learn some of the better ways to go about it. And I wanted to start with something that came across the news earlier this week, was brought to my attention by a student of mine named Wendy Alexander, a story out of California. And so I'm going to play that video for us, and then we'll chat. And here we go.
Has that story for us.
It's every parent's nightmare captured in vivid detail. Watch as this 13-year-old girl is attacked inside her own home. The horror beginning on her walk home from school. You can see the man follow her up to her door and then force his way in. But the teen, backpack still on, fights back.
I try to get him off of me.
Her identity hidden, that brave teen now speaking out.
I push him back and then I slam my hand into his face, and that's when he decides to get off of me.
After several agonizing moments, the man leaves, the teen shaken, hides in the closet and for help. Now guess what? To take a look at the man who caused them so much terror. Turns out they say the same.
Looks like we're having some video issues there, but we saw the main thrust of the situation. And so to recap, this young woman was followed home from school. A guy used a lure to get close to her, and then when she tried to escape into her house, he pushed the door open and attacked her, and we saw that she fought her way back. And so I'd like to start with, there are going to be some people who see the video and see this guy who, in 2020 hindsight, is obviously ghosting her, obviously following her.
Sure.
But realistically, I don't think that it would be reasonable to expect somebody to notice that. On a road like that, you'd be aware of that person, but
Sure.
he was at a distance from her that until he actually kind of turned towards the house, it's a big ask for a 13-year-old to be that tactically aware.
Sure.
Yeah, and I do want to, congratulate that when she was attacked, she didn't curl up and just comply. She attacked the guy. She shoved him. She hit him in the face.
Sure.
Which, we're martial artists. Hit bad guys in the face. Well, actually, hit them in a softer body part so your hand doesn't break. But hit bad guys is the main takeaway here.
Right.
But there are a few errors that I've already told my son about that I'd like him to do differently, and some things she did that I'd like him to do the same. And the first one was, and this is a very important safety concept, is that she voluntarily moved to crime scene number 2. And Richard, could you explain to the audience what is crime scene number 2 and what did she do that brought her there?
Sure. This is a really interesting case of moving from crime scene 1 to crime scene 2, or from initial contact to crime scene 2, because usually getting to crime scene 2 involves being forcibly taken there. And even if you're complying under a threat of violence. In this instance, she moved herself to crime scene 2 intentionally, just because she didn't realize that he was there. Crime scene 2 is where, as Rory Miller would put it, a process predator, which is someone who doesn't want you or your resources or something that you have, they want you. They actually are looking for the experience of harming another person, whether they're murderers or they're rapists or emotionally disturbed people in some capacity. That's where they're going to get you in order to have nice, quiet, alone time with you. And so one of the cardinal rules in self-defense is don't ever go to crime scene 2. In this instance, she just kind of got ambushed. It's like you were saying, if you notice from the video, he comes in from a 90-degree angle to the door. She goes in the door and he just shoots that gap really, really quickly before she closes the door all the way. So, I mean, he was it almost looked like he had some experience in the way that he did it, in the way that he followed her, in the way that he slipped in there. But yeah, she moved herself to crime scene 2. Now, we had this discussion on I believe the last of the Prevail podcast when we had Rory Miller on with us, because he talked about on that particular podcast, crime scene 2 is not usually the victim's home. There's a reason why home invasions are incredibly rare and incredibly dangerous, because your home is not an environment that the attacker is really going to have a lot of control over. They're going to have a lot more control over you in their home or in some place where they know where everything is, or they're in control of all those factors. So following her into her house like that, unless he knew that nobody was going to be home for a long time, which is certainly possible because in the majority of these situations, the person knows the attacker in some way. But unless he knew that, he doesn't, I mean, you kind of think if he had to, because so if she comes into that space, he's got a limited amount of time that he can be in that space. And he's got to either do what he needs to get done and get away, or he needs to abduct her and take her to another crime scene. In that instance, I don't necessarily know if you could even call it crime scene 2. Maybe he wanted to get her out of her house and into his house or into his van or some other place where he could have better control over her. Maybe he wasn't even thinking about that. So I guess that a couple things that I noticed right away there is that I don't necessarily know if it is crime scene 2 just because of that factor.
Yeah. Could be crime scene 1.5. But the important thing, this mistake I saw was she moved from an area that was reasonably public out on a public street into an area where the bad guy could be unsupervised with her.
Sure.
And that is a tactical error, a safety error of immense proportions that unfortunately the media, which is where most of us get our information about violence, or I should say fictional media, which is where most of us get our information about violence, often has the dramatic trope of kidnapping and of hostage situations where we're taught by the action stars that we watch that if somebody threatens you to go ahead and comply. But the truth is that if there's a bad guy threatening you and saying, hey, come to this quiet out of the way place with me, and you say no and start leaving and they shoot you, if they were willing to shoot you in the parking lot or on the street, what they would be willing to do to you in private is not good. And so, yeah, never, ever, ever go to a more secluded place, a more private place, if you're feeling like you're being threatened at all. And in this particular case, if that, I would have my child just walk next door. We live in a neighborhood where he's good friends with the family next door. There's always somebody home. It's a large, large family with the umpteen million kids and a mom and a grandma at home all the time. Lots of noise, lots of family. And because predators are cowards, that same guy who, let's be clear, that guy was driven off by a 13-year-old girl because she hurt him too much for him to want to keep playing. A guy like that isn't going to walk into a house with a bunch of people and continue trying to be a bad guy.
Sure.
And
well,
so
that also presupposes that she knew she was being followed. I think, it's pretty clear that she didn't know she was being followed. Yeah. Or if she did know she was being followed, she didn't see the person as a threat. And
Yeah.
so, you know, for her to take an evasive maneuver like going to a neighbor's house instead of to her house really presupposes that she knew she was being followed, and that she would actually be able to think of that as a ploy or as a test to see where
That's a
he
very
follows her to, you know?
We're actually talking about two different things there. And that's absolutely true. If you feel like you're being followed, never go home to your car, go immediately to the large public area. But I'm talking about when she was on her step and the guy approached her there and started talking to her and asking lures. It's clear that she wasn't taught to pay attention to how he moved and the things that he apparently said. But that there would be a tripping point for my son, and he would hightail it to a place where he knew there was an adult.
Sure. Now, I'm sorry. In the video, did they have conversation at the beginning there, or did he just slip in from the side?
So he walked right up and apparently asked her for directions. A classic lure.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's actually something that that I want to bring up later on too, about how a teenager should respond to anything that even smells like a lure. But the point being that if I'm a 13-year-old girl and there's an adult male who's acting in that way, I am walking, running, screaming if necessary to the nearest place that has an adult in it.
Sure.
And my home, where I know my parents aren't, is not that place.
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely.
What's
absolutely correct.
Yeah. What's something you saw, good or bad?
Well, and this actually kind of feeds into something, because I own my own martial arts studio, and just the other day we had a seminar in something called Fast Defense, and Fast Defense it's a real quick, no nonsense introduction to physical, adrenal based, scenario based self-defense training. And what happened in this instance is actually very similar to what we train and practice for in the fast defense scenarios. Mm-hmm. So here he entered, and it appeared that he grabbed her. It's blurred out to protect her identity, but it appears that he grabbed her and was trying to choke her or grab at her clothing. And she, when her hand came up, her hands were above, it looked like he grabbed her hands, or he was continuing to try to grab at her clothing or at her throat. And in this instance, actually having her back against the wall in that corner, I think helped her, because she would have lost her balance and fallen otherwise. And she actually, from the way that it looks, she is able to lean against, bolster herself against the wall and push off against the wall in order to keep her balance and turn the tide of the movement in towards coming at him, as opposed to being pushed back. So I think the wall helped her. I think the corner helped her in that instance. Mm-hmm. And the hand positioning was kind of the same thing that we train in the fast defense. It looked like to me, she actually tried to bring a knee up, like she was going to knee him, or she was going to try to push off. And I think that if she had thrown knees there, they actually would have connected. I think she would have had a really, really good chance of making contact with him. And it doesn't look to me like she actually did, but that's another thing that we do in the fast defense from a very similar type position, where you're hitting at the face and the person grabs your hands or grabs at your clothing in order to try to stop their face being hit or the eyes being attacked, and they open up the groin and you start throwing knees at the groin until they go down or until they retreat or until you can get them off of you. And that's kind of very similar to what happened in this situation.
Mm. Actually, you have a little video of a fast defense training session. Are you in a position to cue it up and show folks what you're talking about? Yeah,
I have it now, and I guess what I'd like to do maybe is I'll go through it once with the audio of the event, and then maybe we go back with the audio and with the audio off, and maybe we can talk through it and see sort of where maybe there are positions that are similar, or go back and compare the videos. So here is the scenario. This is fast defense. This is Bill Kipp and Dick Chance's system. Can you see the video there? All right. And this was a young woman who is part of one of my my colleagues' schools, who came to also do the training. And we'll just take a look at what's happening in the video.
Nice. Nice. Now, that one was black for about half of it for me, but that might be because my Malaysian internet is not up to speed. But we'll make sure that we have a link to a YouTube video of fast defense in the show notes in case that's true for everybody or even somebody. But yeah, I see exactly what you said about how the position that that student was in was very similar to the position that the girl was in. And that her response was very similar to that fast defense trained reaction. It does make me wonder, like we talked about before the show, whether or not she had some training.
My just perception would be probably not. Or if she did, it wasn't of a type that was that really would have necessarily prepared her. But her, I mean, this kind of goes back to one of those things that Rory Miller and I love to talk about when he comes, which is more people with absolutely no training and absolutely no experience defending themselves or doing martial arts or anything, defend themselves successfully by doing nothing more than just relying on their lizard brain, just relying on the capacity for their biological reflexes, reactions to kick in. And then our trained people who do the same thing. Oftentimes training can be a hindrance because you freeze when things aren't necessarily the way that you expect them to be, or your body mechanics are out of place because you've never really done anything like that before. But we are, as biological creatures, just programmed to survive. We are the alpha predators. We are the apex predators on this planet. And if we allow ourselves to just get past that social conditioning, then oftentimes we just know how to protect ourselves intuitively. And it seems like that's what she did in this instance.
Yes. And that's, I think, the takeaway is that is one thing in this situation she did exactly right. When she realized the situation was bad, she didn't try to convince herself that it wasn't bad. Mm-hmm. She didn't let herself be controlled by social conditioning and try to be polite. She fought back, and she fought back vigorously until she was free. Now, that does bring me to, I think, the other biggest error that happened there was when she got free. You'll remember from the video, there were several seconds where the guy was standing in the doorway and she was standing in the hallway. And if you watch the video just from that point, you might have been justified in thinking that they were just having a conversation. Where if you have been attacked, a guy has put a hands on you and you get enough distance to run away as fast and as loudly as possible. Or in this case, this 13-year-old girl who was with a man that she knew was willing to put hands on her to try to hurt her, just kind of stood there and watched. Mm-hmm. Which is something that, if it was me, 40-year-old, reasonably athletic, 30 years of martial arts training, been in a handful of tussles, have done security stuff professionally. If I were in that situation and fought a guy off and was there, I would be running away as quickly as possible out my back door to go summon the police. Sure. There's no reason to expect a 13-year-old girl to do otherwise.
Right. It's absolutely true. It can also, there's also this issue of it's very hard to flee from your own domicile.
Yes.
Especially when you're in a panic reaction like that. I mean, this is very clearly a castle doctrine situation from a legal standpoint too, is that legally she's not under any obligation to necessarily run away. She can, I don't know what state this was in, but most states recognize that, she would have been completely justified in going all the way to lethal force right there. Because when you're attacked inside your own home, the presumption is, what safer place should there be for you than your own home?
Yes.
You're already there being attacked. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't flee your own home.
Exactly. It's psychologically difficult to flee your own home, but kind of like you said earlier, logistically, it's much easier for you to escape a bad guy in a place you know as intimately as your house than anywhere else. It's psychologically difficult, but what is courage except for doing psychologically difficult things when it's important to do those things?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
it's a really, really good video, and I'm glad you caught it. And it's just funny that video and the fast defense that we did last week, and it just happened to be that she was in a very similar physical position, that knee sort of presented itself, that she responded in the way that she did. And I'm very glad for her too, that her taking action, probably just instinctively without even thinking about it, it meant that she's safe,
Yes.
That's the most important thing.
Yes. And some resources to look into if you want to train your child, your family. Bill Kipp's Fast Defense is a program for that kind of situation, for people who aren't necessarily interested in making a lifetime study of martial arts, but want to be able to have a few more tools in their toolbox for that one time in their life that's the worst day of their life. Bill Kipp's an excellent resource. For some of the tactical things, Gavin DeBecker's The Gift of Fear and its follow-up, Protecting the Gift, will help a lot in terms of knowing when to spot and how to spot a predator who's getting too close to you, and how to make decisions she could have made that would have made it so she didn't have to defend herself. I think this podcast is going to eventually break a world record for the most times Gavin DeBecker is mentioned in a podcast, because those two books are just the go-tos for family safety. Then the other thing on that I think we should bring up in terms of fleeing the home, and this comes from, among others, Sanford Strong, who wrote Strong on Defense. In terms of fleeing your house, as a parent, if I were to come home and find a bad guy in the home harming my children or threatening to harm my children, the best course of action, according to everybody who knows, is to immediately turn around and leave and call the police. That is the best thing to do. Because if you go in and try to stop him, you fail because this guy's better at violence than you, which is likely, then who's coming to help?
Exactly.
And speaking of doing something that's psychologically difficult. And interestingly, in that book, Strong on Defense, the way he puts it, this isn't a direct quote, but it's the general gist. That's the thing that parents should do. I've never been able to talk a parent into doing that, so here's the second best thing you can do.
Sure.
But understanding that in that situation, your first responsibility is to get more help. And then you can see to the psychological damage of your children seeing you flee the scene, of the damage to your marriage if it's your wife in that situation, and you open the door, see the situation, and run back out. But leaving and calling the police is the best way to make sure that there's further life in which to solve that psychological damage.
And it's like you said, there are the quote unquote best decisions. No decision is going to be the best decision 100% of the time.
Yes.
It's always and never. It's like I say at the dojo, always and never the things that'll get you killed.
Yes.
There is no such thing as always and never. You can pretty much be certain that the guy's not going to levitate and shoot fireballs out his ass, right? Like, we have to work within the realm of physics and biology. But as long as we're pretty much obeying those parameters, always and never the things that'll get you killed. He's not always going to do this, even though it makes the most sense. You're not never going to do that, because there's just such a broad range of human behavior and way that so many factors, ways that things that can pan out. However, we do have just responses. And it's like you said, it's going to be virtually impossible to stop a parent from, rushing in and trying to help at that moment. And you know what? There's many instances of when it actually could be the right thing to do. There was, I'll share a story later tonight, but it's a story that I shared on the Prevail podcast with Rory Miller. And it involved me rushing someone with a knife who had taken out the knife and said he was going to kill me with the knife. And I rushed him. And I was talking with Rory about just what a ridiculous thing that was to do. It was just it was the most foolhardy thing. And he said, well, you know what? You're here. Mm-hmm. And you didn't get killed, and so you don't know if it was the right thing or not, or at least in the most absolute term available, it was the right thing because you're here, or not that it was the right thing, it wasn't the wrong thing. I think was what he said, because you're here. And so that's kind of one of those things that the elephant is so big, the topic is so huge that always and never are the things that that we trip up on.
Absolutely agreed. Now, we had talked about doing 2 stories each, but, we spent so long dissecting this, and I'd like to give our other stories the same detailed treatment. I think let's go with 1 story each for today, and then if people like these episodes, we'll do a couple more in the future.
Sure.
So let's go with you. What's one of your war stories, self-defense stories, where good, bad, or different here, so you didn't make all the mistakes? And let's talk about what went well, what went poorly, and what folks can learn.
So I don't want to offer something too innocuous, but I also don't want to offer something too serious, for the first time out. So there's some stuff that outside of like a therapist's office, I just haven't spoken about with anyone. So I'll tell the story that's on the Prevail podcast that I told when Rory was there, which was I was just about 20 years old. I was in my second year of college, and I'd come back for the summer, and I had a friend who wanted to, he and his family had a home on a small island location up here in the Northeast. I'm not going to say exactly where, but we were on the island for 3-4 days. And their house was just a little beach shack. It was just little. I don't even think there was any running water. There was toilet, but there was no, running water or anything. And it was small. It was cozy. It was really just right up against the water. It was really nice. And so we just stayed there for a couple of days, and we were, hanging out on the beach and whatnot. And then one evening, it was the last night that we were there. A couple of guys came down the beach, and you could tell that they were a little drunk and a little belligerent. And there was one, they're also older than us. So I was about 20, and I was there with 2 other guys, and they were both, I think, 18, 19. And these guys were like early 30s, mid 30s. And they were bigger than us. They were a little more rough and tumble than us. And it was clear that they were like a football crew or rugby guys or soccer or something. But they were, they were guys who were used to sort of mixing it up a little bit. And I was with 2 guys who really probably weighed 200 pounds soaking wet and holding a brick and wouldn't have been able to fight their ways out of wet paper bags. And not that it's a bad thing, it's just that's what I had to work with. And they came down, they plopped themselves down at our fire and started drinking our beer, and we're just kind of being assholes. And then it kind of went from them being assholes to them actually pushing and shoving and arguing. And so it kind of one of their guys targeted one of my friends, and this was just such a mismatch. You've got like an 18-year-old high school senior and a guy who's probably 32, 33 years old who outweighs him by 60 pounds, and they're just. My friend didn't even know what to do, like how to respond. He was just kind of frozen. And so I had to step in order to kind of take this guy's ire, take his attention off of this kid so that I could try to do something with his behavior. And I actually kept him talking for a considerable amount of time to just kind of let the hurricane blow itself out, let him just say what he needed to say. I tried to submit to the monkey dance, many, many different times, and none of the submissions that I tried really worked. And it kept amping up, and it kept amping up. And finally, we gathered the things. I said, we're leaving. And I turned to go. And he actually physically came and stood in front of me and blocked my path, and put his hands on me in order to stop me from leaving. And I tried to leave one more time. He put his hands on me again. And that's when I dropped everything that was in my hands, and I hit him with a straight. Just kind of dropped back and hit him with a cross, and he fell on his butt. And I said, stay down. And I picked up all the rest of the stuff, and I got up to go and leave again. And he came back around in front of me and made like he was going to push me again. And so I just dropped everything, and I just hit him with another straight right, and he dropped down on his buns again. And I said, don't get up. And then he got back up, and he came to tackle me, and he pretty much just rushed me and tried to tackle me, and I threw him, but somehow in the throw, we got tangled up together, and we ended up rolling down the beach. And in the process of rolling down the beach, I end up underneath him, and he's mounted on top of me. Okay. And I at that point have several years of wrestling underneath me, and and some considerable experience as well. So I didn't panic or freak out. I just kind of grabbed onto the nearest thing in front of me, which was his hair, and I just grabbed a big old handful of hair, and I just pulled him literally off of me from the mounted position by just yanking his hair down to the ground. And when I had I had his hair in my hand, and I had his head pinned against the sand, and I just kept hitting him over and over and over again. And I wasn't even in control of what I was doing at that point. And then there was a certain point where I gained an awareness of what I was doing, of what was happening, that he wasn't fighting back, that he wasn't defending himself. And when I realized that, I let go and I stood up. And that's when he stood up, and I walked over to the edge of the beach, because I felt like I wanted to put my hands like in the water. It was my kind of first response. And as I turned back around, he was standing up, and he had a knife in his hand. And I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but it was something along the lines of, it's time to die. And I was just so angry at the whole thing. I mean, I was in a complete state of, I gave him every out. I didn't, it's not something that I wanted to do. And it was just so traumatic to me, that I just rushed him. And I remember thinking in my moment that in that moment of my mind that I was going to take that knife away from him, and I was going to do serious harm to him with that knife. And you could think, you can see in retrospect how, I mean, that's just such a terrible decision. A, rushing somebody with a knife, and B, with the intent that if you get hold of it, you're going to use it. Like there's nothing good that is going to come out of that situation at all. And at that point, one of his friends came up from behind me and tackled me. So I got about half the distance to him, and I got tackled from behind. And his friend basically held me down and, just said, it's over. Don't worry about it. We've got him. We're leaving. And so the other guy went over and kind of took him aside. And then he let me up, and they took him and went back down the beach and just basically disappeared, down the beach. And so I then went to the police department. What's that?
Best possible result of how that end scene started.
Yeah, I mean, there was, it was one of his guys who I think realized that things suddenly got very, very serious. And so, I mean, he just tackled me from behind. I mean, I was rushing at this guy one moment, and then I'm flat out with my face being like pushed into the sand. Like, what the hell just happened? I thought I tripped, but what an angel on my shoulder, to do that. And that was that stands out for me because it was an instance where in virtually every violent encounter that I've been in the course of my life, it was in some way directly contributed to by my own action of being an asshole or an instigator or, or being out looking for it. And that was an instance of where not only was I not looking for it, I tried every means possible to de-escalate it, even let him push me several times as I was trying to walk away, and then dropped him twice and tried to get away while he was down. And he came back up, and after I did all of that, then he does that. And it was something that had really messed me up for a long time. Like there was a lot of psychological and emotional trauma and fallout from that particular instance. And it wasn't the worst instance that I've been through, but it was probably the most emotionally traumatic, I think. It
sounds like it was one where, like you said, there weren't mistakes you were making before contact that led up to it. And so I think it could really very much shatter that illusion of safety that a lot of us have. Where, like you said, a lot of the other altercations you got into were ones where there was stuff before you made contact where you could have made some other decisions, but you were minding your own business, sitting around a fire having a good time.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, is I went immediately to the police department and I filed a report.
Good.
And that was, I think, the right thing to do. And it's not something that we necessarily think about in terms of, the self-defense is, what if there isn't a police officer there? What if there is nobody to make a report but you? What if you don't say anything? Then nothing is going to be made of it, Yeah. And especially if it's your word versus a local person's word, that can actually be tricky. And, and you actually might be in a position like we've talked about in prior podcasts where you actually don't want to go to the police unless it's absolutely necessary. But that was an instance where I felt it was really a smart thing to do. It was an important thing to do.
I think that's one of the highlights of the smart, as you said, one of the smart things to do, one of the good decisions you made there was going to law enforcement and filing a police report. Because a lot of 20-year-olds who got into a tussle, which is what happened, wouldn't think to do that. But these guys are enough older than you guys and were behaving in a predatory way. And there's always the chance that guy who you'd hit a bunch of times could have gone to the police and filed a report against you.
Well, and that's what I was worried about.
Yeah. One of the big errors there that I know I've also made, and I find this really common in people who are trained, is you're too patient with that guy. Because we got our training, because we have that de-escalation, you'd ask these guys to leave you alone. You'd try to de-escalate him. You were leaving the situation. He put hands on to stop you from leaving. A normal, untrained individual would have been totally justified in just ruining that guy at that moment.
Sure.
But because we feel that greater responsibility to scale our response, to sit, to knock the guy down, say, stay down, and let him get up and put hands again, we sometimes can end up in situations that are more dangerous because we didn't give ourselves permission to go ahead and do like you did on the third time you clashed and hit him till he stops defending himself. So that's something I know I've made that mistake as well. And for both of us, we're still here. So how big a mistake could it be?
It wasn't
but for a lot of people. Right. Yeah, exactly. It wasn't the worst case scenario.
Right.
But that gets into people who are trained also have that problem with giving themselves permission to respond violently, whether that's physically violent or by yelling and screaming and just turning on the asshole switch, and end up in a worse situation because we allow it to escalate. Or, and then that gets to the second piece about because people in those kind of group situations warm up and escalate, would they have stopped you from leaving if you guys had picked up and gone away immediately? Because
right.
Three guys in their 30s sit down with a bunch of kids, start drinking their beer and causing trouble. That situation is not going to get better. That situation is
right.
only going to get worse as more beer comes in and more conversation happens.
Sure.
So it's, what's the line from Aliens? Marines, we are leaving.
Yeah, right.
And,
Right.
would they have let you leave if, 5 minutes after they sat down, you're like, hey guys, we're out of here. Have a great night. Would they have let you leave?
Sure. And, I don't know. I mean, it was very much a locals versus interlopers kind of thing, and it was such a weird violence dynamic because there was a territorial element to it. There was a predatory element to it that was more bullying than it was, process predation or resource predation. But there was a group dynamic, right? There was this one guy who was just almost irrationally, crazily, just attacking everybody with, verbally and just being a jerk. So there was this kind of almost status-seeking show element to it within his group. And that was one of the things that made it difficult because it was this, talk about mixed messages, right? This wasn't like a one clear dynamic that was linear. It took these, very circuitous paths to get to where it did. And, it was something that I took a big lesson from in terms of don't always expect the guy to act reasonably. Yeah. That's one of the biggest mistakes we made is we go, well, a reasonable person would do this, or a rational person would do that, or a sane person would do this. And we base our responses off what our friends would do as rational, sane people. And when somebody does something that's just completely different from that, we tend to freeze and go, huh? And it's during those times that we start to run into trouble. And if you freeze a bunch of times and make little freezes, those can actually stack up so that a lot of little things add up to be one big thing over time. And so anyway, who knows? What about you? Give us a good war story.
So this is one where I feel like I made my mistakes, but I feel like overall, it's a story I tell students sometimes. And this happened when I was living in Japan. I was 27, 28. It was my birthday, so I was 28. I turned 28, and I was walking home from having some drinks with some friends. I wasn't drunk, but I'd had a couple beers in me. And I stopped at this 24-hour noodle joint. And this was an indoor noodle joint, not like a street cart or anything like that. And I ordered my food, and I'm waiting for my food, and sitting on the bench waiting for their food are these 3 guys in suits, and they're just soused. There's a stand-up comic who talks about there's 5 stages of drunkenness unless you live in a trailer park, and then there's 6. Level 7 is Japanese businessman drunk.
Gotcha.
Okay. Yep. And so these guys are there, and they're soused. And while I was waiting for my food, and they were waiting for this food, a woman came in, and not to put too fine a point on it, but it was very clear that she was a mammal. Okay, she had a very, very, very nice figure. And the 3 men walked up and got very close to her and were talking to her in a very kind of creepy way and even touching her. It was clear that they did not know each other, but that they were taking liberties. And she walked away. And one of them tried to follow her. And I stepped in between them. And I didn't even make eye contact. I was looking at the menu, but I just kind of wandered my body into his path. And he pushes me till I face him and puts a finger in my face and points to himself and says, "Yakuza desu," which is Japanese for "I'm Yakuza." Now, the chance of this guy actually being Yakuza is the Japanese mafia for people who haven't watched any TV in the last 20 years. They're the bad guys all the time. But he probably wasn't in the mafia. But he had said, "Yakuza desu." And so I looked at him and I said, "Oh, hajimemashite, Jason desu." "Hi, glad to meet you. I'm Jason, Mr. Yakuza." Pretending to misunderstand him that he'd introduced himself by name.
Nice.
And we proceeded to have this conversation that lasted probably 2 minutes, but felt to me like 30 years, where he was insulting and reviling and threatening me. And I was pretending to misunderstand and giving him innocuous, stupid tourist answers.
Nice.
He's like, "Aren't you afraid of me? I'm going to kick your ass." "Oh, I've been in Japan about 4 months. I'm really enjoying it. Thank you."
Oh, man. That is awesome.
Eventually grabs my hand and makes some comment. I didn't understand the Japanese well enough, but the body language and everything was he was making some reference to Japanese cutting people's fingers off, right?
Yeah.
And so I hold up my ring finger and go, Oh, no, okay, continue. No, I'm not married. At which point he turns around and goes, ah, baka gaijin, which is basically idiot American, idiot Westerner, and storms out of the restaurant. And
that
his buddy
is,
and they took
wow.
off.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
That is my favorite war story.
How old
then
were
I
you?
went home and changed my damn drawers, right?
How old were you?
I think I had just turned 28, and if I hadn't, I had just turned 29.
Nice. At 28, 29, you've got the vocabulary and the smarts to be able to do something like that, you know? I don't know if I don't know. Do you think you would have been able to do the same thing at 19, 20?
Oh, shit, I couldn't have spoken to the Japanese. But yeah, but 20, 21, I probably would have felt the need to punish the guy for daring to, to ride in on the white horse and protect the maiden, right?
Sure.
And the funny thing was, she spent the whole time looking very embarrassed and very uncomfortable and would not make eye contact with me, even after the guys had left. Yeah. But whatever it was. But yeah, that was definitely one of those where, because I had training, because I wasn't in a panic state about getting my ass kicked right there in the middle of the restaurant,
Yeah.
I was able to make some better decisions. And because that 20, 21, 22-year-old testosterone thing was, I was able to keep it on a leash. I was okay with feeling or looking stupid in public to diffuse the situation. Now that said, the shoulder devil told me for years, man, you should have kicked his ass. I mean, you should have just, after he called you that name, you should have just, the shoulder devil loves telling me to clinch a guy up and throw a couple of knees in him and throw him on the floor. And that shoulder devil loves that. And he just always telling me, you should have done that, man. You should have done it to him. Like, A, it wasn't necessary. B, you and I are both very experienced. We've been trained and we've had situations. 90% chance that we're going to be just fine throwing a drunk person smaller than us to the floor. 100% chance I'm not going to get hurt if I don't get in a fight.
Oh, always.
Yeah. Now the big question for me is, in terms of mistakes, is should I have engaged at all?
Right.
We're talking about ages and stages. And 28 years old, 29 years old, unmarried, no children. If the worst case scenario, that guy pulls out a knife and stabs me, or that guy happens to be in the Yakuza and is pissed off at me and I take a bullet in the head some other time.
Sure.
There
sounds also
my
like
parents are.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the lag. I think that the lag gets us sometimes.
Yeah. But worst scenario with that, my parents are sad. But today, with 2 kids and a wife,
whole different situation.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe at that situation, there's that question. I think I mentioned this on an earlier podcast, that a law enforcement friend of mine says that they're trained when they're not on duty to ask, will I be best in this situation as a witness or a participant?
Yeah. And that's the question. Also, it seems like interposing yourself in between her and them, that's something where there's a very small window of opportunity to do that. And if you had let it go on and it had turned out into a situation where you really needed to intervene, and still even then it's you really need to, but you needed to, then you've basically given up your ability to use that ruse, that diversion, because it's very clear once you step in at a point where it's more serious than that you're coming to rescue her, as opposed to just blundering into their thing, blindly as the as the tourist, So there was a window of opportunity for a deception to work there, and you probably would have lost it if you hadn't used it right when you did.
Yeah, exactly. And that was blind luck more than anything else. And looking back at that, analyzing it from the standpoint of family safety, the big question is, did I need to do that? would that woman have been subjected to anything more than another 5 uncomfortable minutes? And again, then you talk about your own personal level of responsibility. As a 28-year-old with nothing to lose, really, no impact to anybody else in my life other than sadness, if that had gone completely tits up.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to as a parent and as a family member, where that situation going completely wrong has profound repercussions on people for whom you are directly responsible.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, as parents, as fathers especially, that's something from a family safety standpoint that we don't think about often and is underserved even by the professional people who train, and is absolutely just ruined by portrayal in media.
Mm-hmm.
That avoiding violence is absolutely our first responsibility. I think really for most people, but especially as fathers and parents. And that gets back, and this kind of wraps everything up, all 3 of the stories, yours, mine, and that news feature we showed at the beginning, about how important situational awareness is and how important making an intelligent, informed decision based on that awareness is to avoiding all of these kinds of situations.
Well put. Well put.
And
you notice that they also they did have enough awareness to have a camera system installed in their home.
Yes.
That's the whole reason why we have that, is because they had a video system installed in their home.
Yes.
And I would have liked to know. I mean, I imagine if they've got a video system, that they also have some sort of an alarm or a panic button or something that goes along with that. I mean, maybe not, but I would assume, and I find it interesting to know, after he fled, how did she contact the authorities? Like, you can't hear any audio there, but there could have been an alarm going as it was happening.
From the news story, from the remainder of the video, she went and hid in her parents' closet and then texted them.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that's right.
And that's actually a very brief war story. I was robbed at gunpoint when I was running a pizza joint to pay through college. And when the authorities came, when the manager came, when the district manager came, they asked me why I didn't hit the panic button. And when they asked me that question was the first time the panic button had occurred to me.
Right.
That, training is...
It's not going to come out unless you've trained it.
Exactly. I knew about the panic button because they pointed to it once when they gave me the tour of the shop and say, "Oh yeah, that's the panic button. You push it if there's a robbery," and that was it.
Right.
So it's very possible that if they had a panic button in their home security system, because she hadn't been trained, because they hadn't done family drills, that she may still not remember that there was a panic button she could have pushed. And that's, I think that's a good takeaway to close on, is all of these stories at one point or another interact with training.
Yep.
Where that young woman's, her mistakes seem to strain from whether or not she had any, took a Taekwondo class or something at one point, her parents and she hadn't trained on making the right decisions in a situation like that. I pointed out that in your situation, your training led you to be restrained in a physical response, that maybe the safest response would have been to escalate a little faster early on. Sure. And although I made some pretty good decisions in mine, almost all of those decisions hinged on having enough training that I didn't feel threatened, that I was able to make smart decisions because I was able to tell the shoulder devil to sit down and stay on the beach for the rest of this game. Sure. And so that gets to training. So what are some training resources that we think would be really great for parents to take, parents to learn, and also training habits to have with their kids?
Sure. And this actually kind of gets into something that I think we'll do in future episodes, which we were talking about, which is laying out a sort of canon of work that we think is really where people should develop their skills. I think Fast Defense is a great resource. I've been through many different programs, some of them really good, some of them really bad. Most of them have some sort of critical failing that makes it such that I don't really choose to be affiliated with them or teach their particular system at all, but I do teach FAST. I do carry it as a product and do it several times a year, because I think it's just awesome training. It's awesome training for people who have no experience. It's awesome training for martial artists. And the way that it's presented, it's quick, it's easy. It makes a lot of sense. It's well organized, and it doesn't try to do too much, nor does it try to lay claim to everything, which I think is what the failing of many of these things can be. So Fast Defense, it's www.fastdefense.com. The Prevail podcast, so prevail.podbean.com is my podcast. We've got interviews with lots of great people over there too. So those are some resources that I think, and of course Rory Miller and all of his body of knowledge, Gavin DeBecker and his works. Who else would you put?
So Mark McYoung, he's got a lot of information. It takes a little to get over his voice. But
Yes.
yeah, as much as I respect him, and he's very active on Facebook, and he's actually much cooler on Facebook than his books. But his books really tend to sound like he's saying, "Man, I'm a badass. Oh, I'm such a badass. Here's some very useful information. Oh, I'm such a badass. Did I mention I'm a badass? Oh, and here's some more useful information. Oh man, did I say how much of a badass I am?" But if you get over that,
Yeah.
he's got some really, really great advice. And then one resource, and I think we should do a whole episode on this, so I'll can of worms this till next time, is about family drills. You're supposed to do fire drills.
Mm-hmm.
And you do emergency drills. Doing some family out self-defense situations where each child has a role, just like a good fire safety drill has. Each child knows exactly what they're supposed to do. And the better drills give some kind of safe assignment even to the youngest members of the household, so that they have a thing to do.
Yep.
And applying that concept to, what if somebody comes up and approaches you in a way that feels hinky? What if somebody approaches you and your younger sibling? What if dad spots something and says the code word in a busy street? You saw some of my work on that during my test at Alabama last year.
Yes. Yep.
Those drills are important, and I think we should do a whole episode on that. And speaking of whole episodes, we're coming to the end of time. So,
all right.
Yeah, thank you so much for your stories and everything, and we'll see you guys next time. And let's close out the way that has become the standard.
Thank you for listening, everybody. And remember, you are stronger than you think you are.